controversial opinion of the day is I don't like the Brontes. I just don't like their writing, and I don't think it's very good. Now, one shouldn't slam on teenagers, and these girls were teenagers with a very limited worldview when they started writing. I don't approve of slamming most teenagers' books, though I'll make an exception for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was appalling. So while I don't like them in general, and I loathed them when I was a teenager, I've come to appreciate them more as an adult. I think it was 2020 that I made a year of reading the classics. I read heaps of classic books that I had either had never read or was rereading, and I found an appreciation for many that I hadn't enjoyed as much when I was young. So, Jane Eyre, the classic that everyone knows, though surprisingly few seem to have actually read. A lot of the people who know this book so well, when you examine them, what they know is a movie, which isn't the same. And I think a lot of those people who love the movie would not love reading this much of a book of the type of writing that this is. As well as being a book that I had to reread from childhood in order to even slightly appreciate, this is also the book, this very one, that's started leading me away from relying as heavily on Goodreads for reviews as I used to, because I have read this book and published reviews on it at least 3 times. I don't know if Goodreads has deleted the reviews, I didn't know they did that, or hidden them so successfully that I can't find them, because it does do that fairly often. But I need this review. I don't plan on rereading this book for another 5 to 10 years at least. I don't think I need to. But I want my review available. So, this is such a classical book, and a lot of the social awareness associated with this book does come from word of mouth and from the film versions, like I said. When I reread this in my 20s, I liked the pace and writing, but I loathed the character and I loathed the implied morals, and I generally didn't enjoy the book. At no point in my life, including now, can I stand this dear reader style of writing. I don't like, in general, the writing to the diary tactic, though it was good in Daddy Longlegs. I don't like the writing letter tactics. It took me a couple of decades to even be able to deal with it in Lady Susan from Austen, who I do like. Yeah, I guess I'm one of those classic people. You either like Austen or you like the Brontes, but you don't like both. Hi, that's me. So, as an elder, more critical reader, I can pinpoint the things that young Deborah didn't like about this novel, and I can sometimes deal with them better. Now, in this book, not the movie versions, the book, we start out with Jane as an orphan 10-year-old in her aunt's house. Now, the aunt promised to keep Jane and raise her as her own child, but as she loathes Jane, for no very good reason that's ever given in this book, mind you, she allows her to be tormented, tortured, bullied, abused, underfed, and generally treated horribly by her children and by the servants and by everyone she encounters. This is not uplifting reading, it's child abuse, let's be honest, but it's a fairly short section. The most baffling thing in this section, though, is the servant Bessie. Bessie, we are told on page 1, is as nasty to Jane as she can be, and every bit as nasty as to her as everyone else is. She's instrumental in many of her punishments. Bessie instigates some of those punishments. But then, she is foisted on us later by the author as being someone that Jane loves and clings to. What is this? Stockholm Syndrome? Which is highly questionable, but I won't get into that. This is an underlying theme of a lot of Charlotte Bronte's work. People who abused, who then love the people who are abusing them, and it makes me seriously doubt the lifestyle of the Bronte sisters. Anyway, so luckily that section is shortish. It ends with the evil aunt sending Jane to boarding school. As the aunt loathes Jane with every fibre of her being, she makes sure that the boarding school is going to torture her thoroughly. It's a foundling school. A lot of the people there aren't paid for. But even the ones who are having their board and tuition paid for still get beaten, abused and starved, which is charming. Was this common in the era? I found myself wondering a lot, is this common in the era, or is this common in Charlotte Bronte's brain? It's definitely common in the latter. This former, I'm not sure. Anyway, Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist had it good compared to Jane Eyre. We do get a bit of indication before Jane is sent away when she talks back to her aunt before leaving, and how likely it is that a thoroughly abused and coward 10-year-old will talk back to her aunt in that fashion, I'm not sure, but it was still enjoyable reading. It was better than the section much later in the book where Jane, as an adult, comes back to her dying aunt's bedside and is nice to her. It's like, what? What is that? If you want to write a limp dish rag, it's like, call it out for what it is. But Charlotte Bronte's religion, I think, has a lot to do with a lot of the things I really dislike in this book, and that comes out even more as you continue in this school that the young Jane Eyre is sent to. So, and this, I think, is where the younger me reader had a lot of problems. I don't really get that part of religion that tells you it's a good thing to be hurt and humiliated. But Charlotte was obviously on board with this stuff. So the treatment given to the children in the school is horrific. But the author does not seem to object to it that much. And that was a problem for teenage Deb. The students seem to bear with it, not that they've got very much choice, really. But it's disturbing reading. Again, the author doesn't seem to see it that way. Okay, the other thing about this part of the story is the heavy Christian moralizing. This is where it really starts to really hit you over the head with a blank plank. Jane Eyre's befriended by Helen Burns, a fellow schoolgirl who Jane admires. And Helen Burns, who Charlotte Bronte obviously admires as well, and she's a bit of a mouthpiece, one feels, for Charlotte. She tells Jane that it's okay for the teachers to punish her severely because she deserves it. Though she's trying her best, and she's a really good girl, but she gets punished severely. And she doesn't long to go home away from all the abuse because she'd been sent here to learn. And abusing her is fine because there's no point in her leaving until she's learnt to be abused. Learnt what? They don't teach them all that much, to be honest. Helen is basically the author's way of telling Jane, and thus us, the readers, dear readers, about the world in which she finds herself. It is a brutal, unkind world in which there's nothing of justice, nothing of fairness, and nothing of kindness, very little of childhood. And that's the story, and that's okay, but the author's blithe attitude to such going-ons is nauseating. Another thing, the teenage Deb absolutely loathed about this book, and even as an adult I'm not really that patient with, is that at this stage Charlotte Bronte starts trying to prove to us just how educated she is. She was educated, by the way. But she has a huge need to inflict other languages on us. In the era when this was written, putting large sections in French, German, Italian, and God knows what, maybe Latin, was acceptable. I suspect that even then it was highly pretentious because not everyone did it. But it probably was fashionable in some circles. I don't think it enhances the reading experience, certainly not for me. In this day and era, most people in large portions of the world, not Europe necessarily, certainly not Switzerland, but I think these days it's probably rare for a native English speaker to also speak and read fluent Italian, German, and French. And in any case, if I buy this book in English, I want to be able to read it in English. And you can't without Google Translate. So I didn't have Google Translate when I first read it as a teenager, loathed it. With justification, I still feel. I know what else. Oh yes, after spending her childhood in this school being abused, though we're told it improves later. And here's another interesting thing. While it's heavily abusive, Charlotte Bronte dwells on every misery. Then we get told that after most of them die of the plague or whatever it was, the school improves and they actually get fed food. Wow. Helen Burns has to die first, of course, but we never see that better bit. It's like Charlotte only likes the bit where tormentation is happening. Don't like the Brontes. Just saying. The next part is when we encounter Jane as an adult of 18. That's not even a young adult these days. This is a child, but yeah, she's an adult of the era. She is still in the same school where she has always been. She's never left. Now then, she is a tutor. I'm not sure if she's an actual teacher or a tutor, but anyway, she stayed on to keep teaching children. It's a historical reality that an 18-year-old was a woman. I'm not arguing against that. Jane, however, decides to leave the school and become a governess when her favourite friend and teacher departs, and she ends up in a certain sequence of events at Mr. Rochester's house of Thornfield Hall, teaching his ward Adele. This is the point where we can insert a lot more French, because Adele's mother was French, or she came from France, or something like that. Anyway, heaps more French. And by now I was no longer even bothering with Google Translate. I have a modicum of French, but not enough for this, and not enough to care what a child is saying, or what a governess is saying to the child. Of course, Jane is slowly falling in love with Mr. Rochester. Now, dear reader, let us examine this situation. We've got an 18-year-old girl who has been brutalized, abused, and neglected her whole life. She's falling in love with practically the first man she has ever met, while she is his employee and he is her employer. He is much older than her, he is successful, he is wealthy. The only justification that we have for her falling in love with him, really, is that he is the first man she has ever met, and he treats her with a modicum of kindness. Not a lot of kindness, mind you. Most people treat their pet dog with more kindness. He treats her with just enough kindness to put him head and shoulders above anyone she's ever met, and she falls in love with him. Actually, he can be pretty abusive as well, but still better than most of the abuse she's copped. Now, the fact that this is represented as a love story utterly mystifies me. This is not a love story. This is an abuse story from start to finish. And Mr. Rocher abuses her in many, many ways. Love story. Dear reader, I married him. And my response is, no! Run! Run for the hills! Become a beggar on London streets. Do not marry him. Whatever. Love story of the century. Now, as an adult reader, I didn't hate the actual reading experience. It's beautifully dark, warped story. It's very, very churchy and religious-y and gaudy. But I do hate the underlying principles of it from start to finish. So, oh yes, then of course, just as they're getting married, we find out Mr. Rochester's got a secret madwoman of a wife in an attic. No one mentions bigamy, so I'll mention it, bigamy. Marvellous imagery of the interrupted wedding follows the expose of the horrible, horrible history. Great stuff, really. Probably some of the best writing of Charlotte Bronte that I've read, certainly the best in this book. Then Jane flees the house on foot with no possessions. Not sure how believable that bit is either, but it makes for a good story. It's no less believable than Wuthering Heights. She ends up with cousins that she never knew existed, but they find out that eventually. Insert opportunity for Charlotte Bronte to prove extensively that she knows a lot of German. Warm up that Google Translate if you want to know what's being said. This section is quite nice though, and it's fascinating, up until we come up hard against the person of St. John. Now this bit was, once again, horrific to read, and not for the obvious reasons. St. John wants to marry Jane so she can become his missionary wife, because he needs a wife? Because he doesn't like her? He doesn't seem to. Just because. The emotionally manipulative ways he uses to browbeat her into doing what she doesn't want to do are appalling. He probably wants her money too, because apparently she has them. Again, we're up against Jane being abused consistently, but she seems to like it. Or at least the author seems to thoroughly approve of St. John, and the reader is repeatedly told what a wonderful man he is. No, not a wonderful man. Not at all. St. John's God seems a particularly nasty version of the Christian God. I assume it's also Charlotte Bronte's version, because I assume that one's pretty nasty based on this book as well. His dogma is, or should be, repugnant to the modern reader, or indeed any reader of any era. I won't even get into what I think about missionaries, but not all of them were bad, and I know that they were highly approved of in the era this was written by certain sectors of society, the more religious ones, which would be the Brontes, obviously. Now, steadfast in her love for Mr. Rochester, Jane resists the blandishments of St. John, and she's eventually reunited with the widowed Mr. Rochester, so they now can marry legally and without any moralistic discussion of the fact that he was just about to marry her when he wasn't single. Bigamy! Right, so at that point one actually is grateful that she's marrying Mr. Rochester. I mean, I'd have been happier if she'd run to the London streets and escaped both him and St. John, but out of St. John and Rochester, the two terrible options available to her, because obviously those aren't too many options available to her, Rochester might actually be the slightly better one. At least she won't be going off into the tropics to try wearing corsets on Tonga and eventually die of dysentery or something. I mean, that's got to be A+. So that was the book in terms of the content as seen through my personal eyes, though many people disagree. It is, however, like I've already said, beautifully written. It's atmospheric. The writing isn't poor like it is in other Bronte books. The characterization, while appalling in many ways, is not inconsistent and not terribly unbelievable all of the time, just some of the time. But what it wasn't is in any way feminist. Now, I'm told by several people who should know that Jane Austen is often claimed as a feminist icon. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is claimed as a feminist icon. And I am mystified. Big fat no on anything feminist in this horrible, horrible book. An icon of pathological psychology? Yes, I'll go with that. An icon of child abuse? Sure, that works. Feminism? How? There's nothing strong about her. She's a dishcloth, a wet, limp dishcloth. The only borderline describable part of the love story is that she ends up meeting someone who, in her infinite teenage lack of experience of the world, she thinks it's love. And then she marries them. I suppose that's arguably as much of a love story as many. But it's abusive, it's dark, there's nothing lovely-like in it, and there's nothing feminist about the main character. The morals and ethics of the author were thoroughly, thoroughly questionable, and as they come through in this book, terrible. I'm delighted I took the time to reread it. I didn't hate the reading experience as much as I hated the reading experience in other books that are actually better or worse. I'm glad to have had a chance to form my own opinions. I think other people should read this book before forming their opinions about what they think Jane Eyre is all about, because no movie is going to give you the deeply disturbing elements of this book. Okay, so I've raved about this book for 20 minutes. Obviously I didn't like it. There's always more to say about one you don't like. Yeah, look, read it. It might disturb you deeply. It should.